Hello and welcome to the GraphQL tutorial. This tutorial will be mainly about GraphQL mutations. As I described in the third video of this series, GraphQL mutations are like HTTP post, put or delete actions. They can take data as argument and add or modify it in database. After completing this video, you will be fully capable of using all main functionalities of GraphQL. But before we start with mutations, let me first implement one missing method for the properties. We haven't added the method for fetching single property by ID. Let's do this. We can start, as always, from the interface of property repository and add there one method, getById. It will return a single property and take the ID as method parameter. Okay, let's jump to the implementation. We can implement missing method and remove the default code that's inside of it. We'll use the linku single or default statement with lambda function comparing the correct ID. Yeah, so now we can use it in a property query. Here we'll add new field with the generic parameter property type. And I will name it property. It needs to have one argument, so as before, create new query arguments object with one query argument of integer graph type. Let's give it a name ID. To resolve this query, we'll use a already created method. As the parameter, we'll use getArgument method and parse the ID into integer. So let's try it. First, I will call the properties query to have property ID to grab and reuse in property query. Here I got one, so only rename the query and inside braces add ID argument with this number. Okay, it's working, that's pretty cool. So now, fully jump to the mutations. Our first mutation will be adding new property into database. User will need to create property object with fields assigned and use GraphQL to insert it. So we can start from the interface iProperty repository. Here I will create new method called add, which will take property as argument and at the same time will return property. It will be very useful with our API because we won't lose the possibility to specify which fields we want to return in single request. So yeah, the mutation will be a query at the same time. It will return just created property. Okay, we can now implement it. It will have a really easy logic. Just using the add method on dbcontext.properties with the argument, and after that saving changes will be enough. At the end, we want to return the same object that has been passed as parameter, because if something strange happens when adding to database, it will throw exception at this line before. What's important here is that the property has its own ID, so before we add it into database, it will not have one, but after adding, it will be assigned. So it's an easy way to indicate whether the entity has been added correctly. So it's time to create some GraphQL specific elements. First, we're gonna start with creating new type inside property folder. I will name it property input type because it's going to be used by users of the API to insert new elements into database. It's also correlated with special GraphQL object, input object graph type, which we need to inherit from. Okay, what the inheritance is needed for? The field method that we have used before in queries changes a little bit. Here, in order to be precise, to not allow user insert wrong data and filter it on GraphQL level, we can specify the generic parameter for the type of field. So the first one will be the name. And let's make it non-null graph type. So user needs to specify it. Without the name, this mutation will fail. And inside the generic parameter, we can put string graph type to say that it's a string. Yeah, and inside these braces, we need to add a string, the name of this parameter. Okay, so after the first one, we can set the city, the family, and the street exactly the same way, but don't make them not null. They can be optional. And at the end, the value of the property as integer. Okay, that's it in this file. Now let's use it. New folder in the API project is needed. We've got queries, so why not mutations? Yeah, as always, add new class called property mutation. And here, also inherit from object graph type. We'll need to use property repository, so inject it into constructor of this class. Okay, let's jump now to assigning the field method. It will return property type, so we need to add it as generic parameter to this method. I will call it addProperty. Here, assign to arguments new query arguments object, and inside of it one query argument of non-null graph type of property input type. Yeah, it's a little bit complicated, this nesting of generic parameters, but after reading it, it makes sense. So the last thing is the name of the argument. Property will be okay. So how do we want to resolve it? First, we need to access the context object and get the property argument. We don't need to check here if it's null, because we have used non-null graph type, so it's validated there. And use the method add on the property repository and at the same time return the result of this method. We are about to finish, just the configuration stuff, and we can test the mutations functionality. One thing that is missing is adding the mutation into the schema. So let's do it. It will be an easy one. Just assign to the mutation property our newly created mutation with the help of dependency resolver. Speaking about dependencies, we haven't added them into the startup class. There are two of them, both needs to be registered as singleton, the property mutation and the property input type. Okay, that's it. We can test it now. Start this application and see the results. Okay, so the first step in order to create a mutation from API perspective is creating the model of the request. So basically it will behave like body in HTTP post request. It can be done in the query variables window. So it needs to begin with braces, and let's give it a name. This variable can have the same name as the parameter of the method, so I will call it property. Okay, this property needs to have a name, like for example new mention. It will be located on Spring Garden Street in Budapest, and William's family will be living there. Okay, we've got the data prepared. Now let's use it. Every mutation needs to start with mutation keyword. After this keyword, we need to define the $property variable to later on use it. It needs to be of type property input type, which we have just created. You can click on the type and see what fields it has inside of it. It is important to add exclamation mark after specifying property input type. The exclamation mark says that it is required, it cannot be null. It's because we used non-null graph type in the API in property mutation class. Okay, so now next curly braces, and here we want to specify the mutation which we want to use. So we'll use add property to set the correct mutation, and inside brackets we want to assign the property variable which needs to be passed to the property object from query variables window. Okay, so inside this mutation method we can specify which fields we want to retrieve back from the API. I want to get back the ID of a newly created property and the name of it to recognize it. So if the ID will be returned, we can be 100% sure that it has been added correctly into database. Let's try it. Yeah, we have it completed. We can make one test to be 100% sure. We can use the query that we have before to get all properties. It can be found here in the History tab if the browser cache wasn't cleaned. Here it is, let's run it. Okay, so we've got now 4 properties. The 4th one is this, which we have added with the mutation. So that's it in this video. You have successfully finished the whole GraphQL tutorial series. I hope you've enjoyed it. Now, it's time for your turn. If you want to become a real expert in GraphQL, you need to practice, practice and practice. You can use this project and extend it, add new queries and mutations. Also, there's another part of GraphQL more related with the API requests, like for example directives, interfaces, fragments and much more. I wish you good luck on your GraphQL journey.